Okay, so I think we can start. So, welcome everybody. This talk is going to show you some best practices, tips and tricks on how to test properly with Odoo. And this is basically a lot of things that I discovered during my professional and personal life working with Odoo. So first of all, a couple of words of who I am. I'm Simone Orsi. I'm 38 years old, and I live in Rome. I'm a Python full stack developer since 12 years, working with Odoo since 11 years. The first one was OpenERP version 5. I'm an OCA board member since this year, and I'm an open source adept. Everything I've done in the software related to software, both in the private and professional life, was always related to open source. I worked at Come2Come for the last 4 years, and then I decided to start a new adventure as a freelancer in May 2020. And you can find me everywhere as CMOC. So let's start with the real talk now. First of all, a disclaimer. I don't want to give you any lesson on what is a unit test or integration test or functional test. And also, I assume you are already familiar a little bit with Odoo testing. So I will not tell you how to run a test in Odoo, if not just for a small example. Also, this talk is only about Python tests. I will not dig into front-end QUnit tests for the JS framework. And also, in the whole talk, I assume one important thing, that speed in test matters, especially in the long term, and especially in the OCA ecosystem, but also for a company ecosystem, whereas you can have tons of modules that will run their test in a build. And if you rely, like we used to do in Come2Come, and now they still do in Come2Come, to get a Docker image right after the build is successfully run, then if you have to wait 1 hour because your build is slow, because your tests are slow, well, that matters, and it's really important to keep this in mind beforehand. So, a quick panoramic on the base test class that Odoo test framework offers. So we have the single transaction case, and which is basically a test case class, whereas every test runs in a single transaction. And so it started with the very first test, and then is rolled back at the very end of the test suite. Most of the time you don't need it. This one is really needed only when you want to make sure that there is consistency in the same transaction. So maybe you have a functional test or an integration test where you have several modules and features playing in a chain, and then you want to make sure that in the context of one transaction, everything is working fine and consistently. Then there is the transaction case, which apparently is the most common one. And in here, the test, every single test runs in its own transaction. So the transaction is started when the single test begins, and is rolled back when the test ends. Then there is a SavepointCase, which is similar to the single transaction case, because all the tests run in the same transaction. The difference is in the fact that after every test, the transaction is rolled back. This is very useful for fast tests, because you can put all the setup that you need shared across all the tests inside a setup of the class. So this makes the test run much faster than using transaction case, especially if you're creating records on for every test. Then you have the HTTP case. This one is very particular because it's the only one that you can use to test 100% the behavior of a controller. So when you define new route in your modules, you should use an HTTP case. And as we'll see, this is not the only way to test a controller, but it is the only way to test that you're actually going to that your routing and your controller is going to work 100% even when the real Odoo instance is up and running. So the first recommendation is use SavepointCase. It's suitable for the majority of our test case. All the probably 95 or 98% of the test suites that I see on the OCA repositories, they can be rewritten with SavepointCase. And this is because basically you set up all the records and the variables only once. And what I see in the OCA, well, not only in the OCA, also in customer project, is that a lot of records, like, I don't know, you need a partner, you need a sale order, you need anything, any record that you might need for your test, often is created and recreated per each test. And this is very consuming, and it can be even more consuming if you don't respect some tricks that I tell you in a while. So if you use this base class, you're going to get a lot of speed because your records and your variables will be created and assigned only at the setup of the class. And all the tests can rely on those variables already. Then another thing that will boost a lot your test speed is disabling tracking. Always do it. That's the recommendation. Always disable tracking, especially when you are creating records. So as I mentioned before, I've seen a lot of test cases that were just creating and recreating records on setup, meaning per each test. Well, when you create, for instance, a simple partner, well, the partner is using the mail tracking capabilities. So every time you're going to create the partner for each test, well, you're not only creating the partner, you're also triggering the full machinery for the tracking. And this is very, very slow. And you don't even need it. Unless you want to test specific tracking features, you don't need it. So this is very important. Always disable it. And here you can see an example on how you can disable it for the whole test suite. Another point is always remember to reset the password. To not send the reset password. When you create a user, Odoo is going to automatically generate the mail for the password reset unless you put this key in the context, no reset password. And this is not only an issue for performance because you are generating an email that you actually don't need, unless, of course, you want to test some behavior, some custom behavior in the email generation. But most of the cases, you don't need it. And most of the cases, we create users all the time in the test, and we don't take care of this. And also, this makes sure that you're not going to send an email. I remember I was working on version 11 or something, and suddenly, by error, I got the mail trap configuration working also for the Travis setup. And I found on Mailtrap all the emails that were coming from Travis. And it was, how that could be possible. And then I discovered that the no reset password flag in the test is actually handy. So remember, always do that. It boosts the speed. It makes sure that you don't generate any records that you don't want. Then another point is avoid res.config.settings. So as you probably know, res.config.settings is a way to centralize the configuration of the modules or several features. And it can be very, very heavy because everyone is using it. So every module that adds configuration is going to extend this module. And if you look at the final schema of this model, at the end of the setup is huge, very huge. It can have tons of fields and tons of machinery that is triggered once you call execute. So first of all, never ever call execute. It can be very heavy. Unless you use it to install module, you know that it has some flag like module underscore, and the module name is going to trigger the installation. But don't do that. I mean, if you have to install a module just for your test, just install it. I mean, it's much more clear for the end user what you're doing, and it's more explicit, and you don't need to call the execute machinery of the res.config settings. And then, since all the settings in there, all the fields in there, they correspond to company fields or adding groups to the default user, or setting defaults or config parameters, well, please do them, add those kind of settings manually, directly. So if you need a group, assign a group. If you need a default, create a default, and so on. And if you really cannot do it without it, then please fall back to set values. That's another method on the res.config settings, and is actually used by execute. But the main difference is that it prevents strange errors for the environment, because when you call execute, it's going to look for modules to install, and at the end is going to reset your environment. So if you rely on particular keys, or everything is attached to the end, well, keep in mind it's going to be reset, and you might have strange surprises in the test. I've been there, done that, and it took me a while to understand why. So once again, you're gonna boost your test speed a lot. And also you're gonna make your test suite preparation code much clearer. And another recommendation is do not use it also in upgrade or migration step, because it's very slow. And as I said, it's going to reset the environment. So let's see how we can test exceptions. So probably you already know how you can test an exception, especially if you are familiar with the standard unit test base class. So the way to test it is just to use self.assertRises, and you pass the class of the exception you're expecting. So this is okay, but my recommendation is always test that that's your real exception, because several times it might happen that you are expecting, like in this case, is a user error to be triggered, but you might be not the only one using that error. So if something fails before your code where you raise this exception, well, you don't even know if your piece of code is running or not. So the recommendation is use the context manager, catch the exception, and right after check if the exception message is the one that you're actually triggering in your custom code. Then test permissions. How can you do that? Well, it's pretty similar to testing the exception. So actually, what you're going to do is test that an access error exception is raised. The recommendation is always test. I mean, especially if you have a complex set of permissions, like with many groups and ACL and so forth, always test both users or all the set of users with all the groups that you need to test. So make sure, for instance, like in this case, that a manager can create a record, and then make sure that the simple user cannot create another record, or it cannot, for instance, unlink that same record. And of course, never use admin to test such cases. And while you do so, another important thing that you should take care of is mute the loggers. So in the test that I showed you before, I was triggering access errors every time, or even deleting records. Well, all these actions are going to produce some entries in the logs. Okay, so this is the way you can mute them, and by doing so, you make sure that there is no useless clutter in the log. So what you want to see in the test log is not actually that the ORM is deleting a record, right? You want to just see if your tests are running. So this is how you disable it, and also probably, well, you gain, I don't know, 1.000 milliseconds, but you speed up a little bit more your tests. Test the unchange and the forms. Oops, I forgot the example. Anyway, you can find a nice class in the test common tools. It's the form class, and the good thing of it is that finally you forget about calling onchanges manually, because in case you don't know it, whenever you create a record or you write on a record, all the machinery that usually runs in a form, like when you do the same action in the UI, you won't get all the onchanges and all the custom behaviors that your form might have. So the recommendation is always use the form class, and you will forget about taking care of any collateral behavior. Now, mocking. There is an Odoo helper, probably not well known, and is only in the transaction case. In there, you find a patch method. What it does is that it patches your class, and then it takes care of adding a cleanup in the tear down of the class. So basically, you set up the patch in the setup, like for every test, and then the tear down is going to roll back your patch. I don't like it for a particular reason, just because it's not explicit, so you don't actually see what you're doing under the hood, and also is not suited for all the testing cases, because, as I mentioned, is only in a transaction case. So if you're working on SavepointCase, you won't find it. Okay, so there are other ways to patch. In any case, it's good to see that it's there. And as you see in this example, Odoo core is using, for instance, to patch the get gravity image on the partner, which is going to call an external service. And you really don't want this when you run your test on your CI. Then another way to patch is using the mock library, the built-in mock library. It's explicit. You can have a context manager. You can also have a decorator, and with this, you can also patch multiple paths per method, and so it's way more powerful. In this example, you see that I wanted to test an SFTP interaction. So what I've done is I patched the two paths that I expected my test to call. So the first one is the client, so that I don't really actually do any call to an SFTP server. And in this case, you see that what I'm trying to simulate is that I get an IO error on the other side. So it's like I'm trying to reach a resource on SFTP, and I expect the resource to not be there. And why I'm testing this, it's because my code, in this case from the storage SFTP module, my code must handle this exception properly. So I triggered an exception, I simulate that the SFTP server triggers this exception, and then I make sure that the make tiers method is called, right? And also I make sure that at the end of the flow, as soon as I added the file is being closed. On the right, you see another example, whereas you can use the context manager with mock patch object in the case you're patching a live object. Otherwise, you have to use the path, as I did in the example on the left. And for instance, here you see that I'm mocking the storage backend because I don't want it to call the real service. So what I do is, okay, when you call binary data, when you try to retrieve binary data, just return my fake binary, and that's it. Another important trick is to mock dates and time properly. There is a nice library which is freezegun, and from there you can import the freeze time. And the important thing is that compared to all the hack or mocking that you can do on the built-in libraries, you will always, or certainly you will face some issue because, first of all, this the freeze time applies to every single date, time, any time-related value. And this is very important because when you run your test, you don't know if someone is using a specific method somewhere else. Maybe they're not using the fields .date on fields .datetime or even the datetime library directly. Okay, especially if you're dealing with external library, so not external Python packages, you don't know how they deal with time. So with freeze time, you make sure that whatever time-related function is called during your test, you're actually freezing the time to the time that you want. And by the way, there is a good news because in version 14, this has been included in the core of Odoo. Great. Now, another important mocking you're probably looking for is the request. Most of us back in the days had a lot of issues into testing a controller or anything that has to deal with the request. And why? Because the request is a very special object which is bound only when you really get a request from the browser. So actually when the full Odoo HTTP server is running. So every time you try to test something that requires the request to be there, you're going to get an unbound error. So finally, from version 12, you get this class. It's mock request. It's in the website module, but it's not related only to the website module. You can use it even if you do not depend on the website. And what it does is that it mocks the request in the right way. And it also adds this object to the request stack, so in the thread, so you don't have to care about anything else. In this example, you see that I want to test a controller, and in that case, I didn't want to test at all the full endpoint, the full controller. Remember what I said before? We can test the controllers even without the HttpCase. This is how you do it. So basically, you initialize your controller, you mock the request, and in this case, I had to set some particular headers, which you set in the HTTP request environ key. And also I had to set some special attribute on the request itself. And then I can call the method that relies on those parameters of the request. So it has a limited override. You can pass these headers or other attributes on the fly at init. So you have to take care of adding your own keys to the headers manually inside your context manager. But it's feasible, and it really gives you a way to get away of to not use HttpCase and just test that particular function. And the disclaimer here is that actually the invader controller that I'm testing, it has already an HttpCase in the base module. So what I wanted to check was just that my particular override of get component context was playing fine as I expected. Test tags. It has been introduced in version 13, as far as I remember. It's basically the trick that the Odoo developers found to run a subset of the tests. To me, it's just a trick because there are more powerful way to run specific tests. I will show you later. So in any case, this is how it works. You get a decorator. You can only decorate classes and not methods. And then you can define which tags are applied to that test class. And later on, when you run the test, you can select with the flag -- test tags which tags you want to run. Two specific tags, post install and at install, are generated automatically. They control when the tests are run. So probably you already know it, but a test can run only if the module that you're testing is installed or it's getting an upgrade. And so with these flags, you make sure that the tests run either at post install and not at install, like this one. So with a minus in front of the tag, you can drop the tag from your class. And then you can also add some custom tags. So imagine that you have a huge set of functional reintegration classes, and you want only to run the ones that affect the sales or the one that affect purchases. Well, then you can tag them with sale and purchase tag and run only those tests. And this is, of course, it's important, especially when you are developing, because you don't want to run the whole suite every time. So a quick parenthesis on what I said before regarding the HttpCase. I think you should avoid it when possible. This is because it slows down tests a lot, because when you run it, Odoo is going, the test suite has to run Odoo headless to be able to do an HTTP request. So it's slow, and if you are very familiar and always use PyTest, well, it's broken. So we have to find a workaround for it. And as I mentioned before, it's only mandatory when you need to test the root registration. So if you want to make sure that your root is properly configured and the paths are working fine, no matter which parameters you use. So my recommendation is that you should split test. You should test the roots. Of course, I'm not saying that you should not test your roots, but then you can test them in an HttpCase, and then you can tag the HttpCase as I did here with a skip if decorator. And here you can disable them using whatever you want. In this case, I'm using an environment variable. So when I run the test with PyTest, what I do is that I put the skip HttpCase in front of my command, and those tests won't run. So this is the trick that you can use if you want to use PyTest and run on the whole suite of the module without having to care about any HttpCase. So talking about standard Odoo and PyTest, how do you run them? Well, you should be familiar with that, with a standard Odoo. So what you do is that you run Odoo, you pass the database, and what actually triggers the test is the -- test enable flag. The stop after init is non-mandatory, but it's sort of mandatory if you're running the test just from the command line and you don't want to wait for the server to be up and running. So stop after init is going to stop your instance right after. And as I mentioned before, to test a module, you have to use -i or -u. This has some big limitation because, first of all, you cannot run any specific subset of the test, if not by using the tags. But as I mentioned, the tags apply only to the class, and you're not actually selecting just that particular test method, right? And also, you have to take care of tagging if you want to have full control, you should tag all your classes with particular and specific tags every time, which might be overwhelming. And a second problem with this is that when you run the test like that, you're not going to run only your test. You're going to run all the tests of the modules that depend on this module. And you might say, yeah, but probably I want that because I want also to test that I'm not breaking anything in the other module. That's fine. But when you are developing and you are focusing only on that specific module and you want to be fast in testing what you change it, this is really time consuming. So the recommendation is use PyTest. You can install it with pip install, and there is a PyTest Odoo library by Camp2Camp. So you will need it to run the test on Odoo, and this is how you run that. So basically, instead of passing the module, you pass the direct path to the module. And as you see here on the second PyTest line, you can use the wildcard to run tests which the test file starts with the same prefix. And this is very handy, whereas maybe you have test sales something, test sales something, test purchase something. So this way you can run all the tests that start with feature 1. Or you can run specific tests inside a test class. And to do so, as you see there, you just pass the full path to the Python file, and then the test class name and the test name. So it's super efficient and super fast because you're going to run only that particular test. Then with this, you can also run the coverage if you have the coverage module library installed, and this is the way you can do it. So I leave you with some links and resources. The Odoo testing docs, which, by the way, have improved a lot in the last few years. So I recommend you go there and read them all. The reference to the FreeScan and to the PyTest Odoo. I'm done. Thank you for joining us. And is there any question?
Thank you very much, Simone. Very, very interesting presentation. Definitely a must-have in any Odoo developers tool belt.
Well, it's like, I don't know, here's that I want to write some guidelines. So I hope this will be the consequence of this talk.
If I may, sorry, I cannot ask questions because I'm still on the panel. It's more a remark, or maybe it's a question also. You mentioned FreeScan is great because it patches everywhere. I think there's one notable exception, which is PostgreSQL. The PostgreSQL internal functions are running in a totally different process. And if you're using now in a view, for instance, in PostgreSQL, this is not affected by FreeScan, and you want to be wary about that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's totally a separate level, and of course, I was talking only on the Python stack. So yeah, but good it's a good remark.
I would like to ask something too.
Yes.
Yes, go ahead.
First of all, hello, Simone. Nice to see you.
Hey.
Nice to see you. Well, the question is about, you said that PyTest Odoo is not compatible with HttpCase, but you really sometimes want to test some HttpCase. So what do you do?
So I skip them for PyTest, and I run the standard Odoo test. That's the only way. So what you maybe want to do is that the HTTP test case is also tagged with a proper tag. So when you run the test using the standard Odoo feature, you can select only those tests. In any case, what I'm saying is that, I'm not saying you should not test using the standard Odoo. You should use both. But when you are developing, it's super time consuming to use only the standard Odoo machinery. So what I do usually is I code only with PyTest. And then at the very end, once I'm ready and everything is done, I do a run with Odoo. And in any case, if you're using a CI, Travis, or not, this is also the only way you're able sometimes to detect some errors, because as I mentioned, you trigger the test for all the modules that might depend on this, and sometimes on Travis you get a different result than local, so you're going to run Odoo test machinery anyway.
Okay, so I thought that it was just a wrapper around Odoo, but it seems like PyTest Odoo is testing other way, no?
Yeah. So there is no workaround yet, if not to avoid running them using PyTest, but only because it's going to be broken. Okay, because your tests are going to fail because the request is not there, and unless you mock it, well, there is no way to make them work.
Okay, so I wanted to add another remark, just like Alexander, and it's about the mock stuff, which well, there is a couple of methods inside the base model of Odoo, which is patch method and unpatch, which helps also with the patching, sometimes easier than with the standard mock library. And another thing is, well, you want to say something about that?
No, it's just no. My remark is only that I find the mock library more explicit. So there, where you write your code of the test, you see 100% what you're doing. That's the only thing.
Yeah. Okay. No, it's just I've been sometimes working with a unit test mock, and it's much harder sometimes for the specific Odoo thing about overriding one method that these methods. But anyway, I agree that it's more powerful. But there's one thing that I think it's worth mentioning, and it's that when you're mocking on, well, mostly when you're testing, but specifically when mocking, it's always important to have a focus about what is your module doing, and now how is it doing it, because that's what you actually care about. You have to somehow emulate the user real interaction and see that it happens what it should happen, because sometimes the mocks just check that I'm calling this method.
Yeah.
What you actually care about is what happens when you call it, not that you are calling it. You know?
Yeah.
And I've had to refactor some whole test suites, very, very, very big, that were all testing how things were being done. And then you have to migrate the module, things change, and all tests break. But the behavior is the same. So
yeah, exactly. And also,
it's important to mention that.
Of course, yeah. Thank you, Jairo. Yeah, the point is also that I skipped completely any discussion about a unit test or functional test or integration test, but I do think they are all important. And the recommendation, at least from my point of view, is that you should write a unit test for every single thing you do, because that helps also in refactoring and also helps detecting. Because in the functional test, you might have something failing, right? And detecting where this thing is failing is much harder if you don't have the unit test underneath. So if you have full unit testing and then the functional test or integration testing to test how this plugs into the rest of the thing, well, that's something. It's something that is going to pay you back for sure, especially when migrating and refactoring.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Very interesting.
For sure, mocking must be used wisely, and it can be easily abused. So
yeah, exactly. It's plenty of example also in the OCA, whereas someone just test if the method got called. But as Jairo mentioned, that's most of the time is not really testing anything. You should really take care of testing what is the result, if possible.
No, sorry, just you actually have coverage to test if something
exactly. And probably if you cannot test the right thing in that case, it might be that you have to split that code or reorganize your code in a way that is more modular and you can test all the pieces.
Yeah, definitely. Often the code that is hard to test is often a sign that some refactoring is needed.
Yeah,
definitely.
yeah, exactly. Well, test-driven development helps a lot.
Yeah. There is questions from Graham asking if you have experience using hypothesis libraries with Odoo testing.
Nope. No.
Me neither. So I don't know if anyone attending has information about hypothesis. Otherwise, feel free to share and can be discussed in Discord too. Yeah, there's discussion about if the -test file option of Odoo and how it compares to PyTest Odoo. The chat.
Okay, let me stop the screen sharing because I don't see the chat. Oh, now it's better. No, Graham, I don't love PyCharm. I hate it.
But from what I gather, PyCharm does support PyTest Odoo. You can launch PyTest Odoo test using PyCharm.
Yeah. I mean, all in all, what PyCharm as well other editors allows you to do is just run a terminal in there, and then you. What I don't really like is that PyCharm, above all, I mean, you just use the menu or some action and you call it. So what I mean is that the developer is not in touch with the shell. And then if you have to do something more complex or you have to want to understand what is going on, probably it just hides things. And yeah, for learning, I don't think is the right thing to do.
But for sure, the PyTest Odoo does work in PyCharm and VS Code, by the way, because it's basically a PyTest plugin, and the test runner of those IDEs just plug at the level of PyTest, and so when you've set up your test database, it just works. And for those who like that, it simply works.
Yeah.
And yeah, there was a question of /test file. It was a little bit above at 11.08.
Yes. My take about test file is PyTest is way more powerful because the test selector in PyTest not only allows you to select a test file, but it allows you to select a test class inside a file and a test method inside a class, or a subset of test method matching a regular expression. And this is so cool because in the case you have maybe your latest change broke 12 tests and you didn't write the test, so they are super slow because you haven't been able to optimize them following Simone's advice. So running these 12 tests in one single file takes maybe 4 minutes. But it's the same error 12 times. So you can either comment out all the tests except one and run with --test file, or you can select the simple one, the basic test which is failing, run just that one using the test selector, I think is -k on the command line option, and fix this one.
But
and
not only,
nice. And also
not only,
jump straight to the debugger from within PyTest when the test fails, without having to edit the code and add a PDB statement or a PDB plus or whatever. And that's also really nice. And finally, PyTest has a reporting which is readable and not depending on the logging of Odoo. And that's because this is just horrible, let's face it.
Yeah, exactly. I agree with Alex. Yeah, you get much more capabilities with PyTest. And I don't know, like running the test in verbose mode or not. So for instance, when you run the test with Odoo, you get a lot of clutter in the log, so you can turn on and off the verbose mode. And I mean, this thing about saving time while you are coding and testing, well, guys, pays back a lot. So if you spend 1 minute to run one single test, is not something nice. I mean, if you have a test suite which is huge, it's going to take like 1 minute, 2 minutes, or 4 minutes. That's too much. You really want to save time while you're coding. And by the way, if you have a bug only for one test, why on earth shall you run the full test suite? Just run that specific test and make sure the bug fix comes.
And then finally run the full test suite. But
exactly.
But how, for instance, how does this PyTest Odoo work? Does it mock the way Odoo loads, or?
You don't care. It works.
Well, I mean, to be not exactly. I mean, for what you said, it's not a wraparound Odoo tests, but it's more a replacement, right?
Yeah, well, first of all, my friend, you can read the code.
Yeah, I'm doing it right now.
No, the point is that it doesn't use. I forgot one drawback that you can have. It doesn't use the Odoo test suite machinery to load the test. So it just go into the module test directory and it loads all the files that start with test and all the classes, of course. So where it finds a test, it's going to run them. And this can be an issue because you might forget to put your to import your test file in the init file of the test folder, which cause your test not to run on Travis. And this is a bad thing, especially if your module has a long life and you traverse across migrations, and basically you're not testing anything on Travis. So once you do that, make sure that you add your file to the test init because it's not needed for PyTest. And I mean, the main difference is this, that you're actually running Odoo, but the discovered, the lookup of the test doesn't use the Odoo one. It relies on the PyTest machinery. And actually, the PyTest Odoo, what it does is it allows to look up for Odoo.addons module.
And you need to pre-install your add-ons before running PyTest.
Exactly. That's the other drawback. As I mentioned in the talk, the module must be installed or already installed and you're upgrading it. With PyTest, what you can experience is that you change something in your models, like a field or something in a view, and you run the test, and your change is not there. And then you have to remember to upgrade the module first and then run the test.
Now, wouldn't it make sense to combine it with something like Click Odoo, which actually runs the whole Odoo thing, and combine that with PyTest, so you have actually reliable tests with good, nice output with filtering, but without with the full Odoo compatibility?
That's a good point. Probably something nice to work on. But the whole point is, by default, I would turn off the feature anyway. In the sense that what makes PyTest much faster is that you don't run any upgrade also, right? So you don't want to run. I mean, if your module doesn't need that, why shall you run an upgrade? If you're changing a single line of Python code, why shall you upgrade the module every time?
It's not just about that. I mean, it would mean that PyTest Odoo could be used in CI, and that would be great because the CI would be
what I'm saying,
way more. I mean,
what
you
I'm
would
saying
be
is that
using the
it should
same
be
tool
optional.
for develop and CI, and you wouldn't have to read a million lines of log each time you have a failure in a test.
I think it's feasible. I mean, even in a local workflow, running a Click Odoo update before running PyTest in Click Odoo update is very fast. I think it's a practical solution to be sure you don't forget to update, but you would need then to exclude some Python code because you would then do the database update all the time, which might still be too slow. But in CI, I think it's practical to pre-install all the modules without tests and then run PyTest Odoo on the pre-installed database. That should be feasible. Never tried that.
Well, actually, comment about that. We have been there, and it's not reliable even with Odoo original tests, because all tests in Odoo and in the OCA and everywhere, just because of the way it's designed, you only can rely in your CI. You only can rely in the test if it's running in install mode. If it's running update mode, all tests are unreliable. I understand that if you're developing a specific module, you can rely on those mostly. Okay. But in the CI, it simply doesn't work. You have to pre-install all the dependency modules and then test while you install the other ones, because otherwise it's gonna have false behaviors. It's gonna false failures and false OKs.
But Gyro, but for the OCA modules, it's reliable, right? Because that's how we've been working.
No,
OCA module, but Travis CI, as far as I know, installs everything up front and only after it runs the tests.
Nope.
No?
It pre-installs the dependencies and then run the test with -i for the add-ons of the repo.
It's the only reliable way now.
There is code in maintainer quality tools that looks at the dependencies to pre-install the dependencies without tests and then run an installation of the local add-ons of the repo in test enable mode. There is still the fact that then it tests the add-ons one by one with all the modules that it has already tested pre-installed, so it somehow depends on the installation order, so you could have side effects with that. But yeah, that's
so. But that for the develop, test, fix cycle, it's terrible, right?
Yes. And for that cycle, indeed, that's for that cycle that PyTest Odoo is very, very helpful, because you have your module installed, and for the quick iteration cycle where you do test-driven development, PyTest Odoo is a real lifesaver and time saver. That's a huge productivity tool when you do test-driven development.
Indeed.
I'd say you cannot even do test-driven development with real test-driven development with when you have to wait 1 minute between each test run when you iterate on your tests. So
indeed, and that also depends on the way you set up your classes.
Yeah,
as I mentioned at the beginning. No, seriously, it has a huge impact. I've seen test cases taking like, I don't know, 10 or 20 seconds, getting to 5, 4, or even 2. It has a huge impact.
Do you think it would make sense to contribute to upstream Odoo something like some helper methods to disable the tracking stuff, to disable the invitations and all of that?
Yeah, I thought about it, but I also imagined the answer. But I will do. Okay, I will try. They will say
I will give you a thumbs up if you do.
Thanks.
But yeah, definitely, if there are Odoo people listening here, having better PyTest support in core Odoo would be really nice.
Well, that would.
I gather actually that PyTest Odoo was created from an experimental branch that Xavier Morel did at Odoo a while ago. Unfortunately, that never landed in core, but.
FreezeGun landed in core finally,
yeah,
so they dropped all the custom mocking of the daytime.
Yeah.
Stefan, I think we are running late for the next talk.
Yes, basically we consumed, I think, all the direct in that interesting discussion, but indeed the next talk should be starting in a few minutes in this room, and that one is going normally to be Joel, but I'm not sure if it's...
Guys, it's been
today,
great
Joel?
to talk with you, to discuss with you. Thank you, Jairo, for your contribution as well, and Daniel. So I leave for a while. I'll let you handle it, Stefan, okay?
Thank you, Simone. Thank you very much.